So super early in the company, the CEO assumes that they and everybody else will wear many hats. And that's the right thing to do when you're fighting for survival. And then as soon as you cross 25 people, sometimes as soon as you cross 12 people, the idea of wearing many hats becomes actually a context switch tax every single time. And you're bringing people into a situation where adaptability or speed actually is causing all sorts of energy leaks.
Welcome to Future Fit Leadership, a podcast for leaders at every stage who want to stay relevant in a world that keeps changing. Leadership has shifted, the pace is faster, the expectations are higher, and the future is calling for a different kind of leader. One who is human-centered, grounded, and able to balance capability with empathy. These conversations bring together global perspectives on the skills and mindsets that help people and organizations thrive. Hello and welcome to Future Fit Leadership. I hope wherever you are listening to this podcast, you are well. One of the biggest questions facing leaders today is this: as our organizations grow, our technology becomes smarter, and the pace of change accelerates, how do we scale without losing the very thing that makes leadership matter in the first place? My guest today is Maximos Lih, executive coach, founder of Emboldened, former Google leader, and someone who has spent years working alongside founders and leadership teams navigating rapid growth, complexity, and transformation. Maximus has had a front row seat to some remarkable stories. He worked with Google, supported hundreds of founders through Google Ventures, witnessed companies like Uber scale at an extraordinary speed, and today helps leaders build high-performing teams without sacrificing culture, trust, or purpose. But what makes Maximus particularly interesting is that his leadership philosophy didn't begin in Silicon Valley. It began with his grandfather, an orphan who taught himself to read, rose to become a four-star general, and left behind a legacy not measured by rank or title, but by the lives he touched along the way. In this conversation, we explore what founders get wrong as they scale, why the best teams think more like Olympic teams than championship teams, what happens when leaders become the bottleneck in their own organization, and why the future of leadership may depend less on having all the answers and more on building trust, clarity, and imagination. We also tackle one of the biggest questions facing leaders today. What does leadership look like when AI does half the thinking? And how do we ensure we continue to build organizations that are not only productive, but deeply human? Please enjoy this conversation with Maximos Lih. Hello, Maximus, all the way from San Francisco in the USA. Welcome to Future Fit Leadership. Great to have you on our podcast. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me, Sandra. Appreciate it. It's great. It's a beautiful day. There's been rains for a little while, but we are now past the flood. So I'm very excited to be here, and thank you so much for having me.
I want to start by talking about your grandfather. And I know it's probably an unusual place to start, but while I was doing my research on you, I read that he had a massive influence on your leadership. And I find that really intriguing and interesting. Can you tell us more about him or what were the lessons on leadership that he taught you?
I really appreciate that question. So my grandfather, my father's father, is somebody that has a tremendous impact on my life. I think that he is really somebody that I wake up every day and I just go, as a leader, I wish that I could live up to all the lessons that he was able to sort of impart onto future generations. So part of it is just what does it mean for leaders to be good ancestors, right, at the center of it. But my grandfather was an orphan. He was dropped off at a Buddhist monastery with like a handkerchief with some of his family tree on it. Very, very small rice village in China. And he grew up, and it was expected that he would go and apprentice to find a trade if he didn't want to become a monk. So he went to go apprentice in different places, and all of those places would micromanage or assume the worst of him because they just thought, well, you were abandoned at birth. You weren't raised properly. There must be something wrong with your genes. There must have been something shameful in your past that then caused this very unfortunate thing to happen. And when he was 14, he was accused of being a thief for the last time. And he ran away, lied about his age, and joined the military. And in the course of the next, 25, 30 years of his life, he taught himself to read. He taught himself music and art and music history, and he taught himself to dress. He's like little notebooks that I've seen where he talks about like where the pants are supposed to break over your boots. Because, if you grew up and you just had uniforms, and also when you have to wear civilian clothes, you have to research to know how they're supposed to be made. And all of those things were only made possible because he ended up into a place of work that also was a community that could see beyond what he was expected to do, right? And actually saw and gave him right an openness to invest in him to be everything that he could be. And that's something that I, as an immigrant and as somebody who still has very vague memories of having come from rice fields, when I look at the world today, every day when I go to the startups that I work with, the question is, right, like, who here is like my grandfather, where on paper it didn't make any sense. My grandfather retired as a four-star general. He then went to be the administrator of a VA hospital with patients with PTSD. And one of the things that I remember people coming up to my family when they would go, and they're like, oh, your grandfather never took bribes. Oh, your grandfather changed my dad's life. Oh, your grandfather.
Mm.
And it was this guy that when he was 10 years old, everybody in the village was like, oh, you came from bad genes, right? That's how leadership can impact everybody that's around us. And that's the value of
Mm.
being a good ancestor, right, for the people around us.
What an incredible story, and a man who would have had so much self-determination around what he achieved and what a legacy he left behind for future generations.
Yeah. And we never talked about it this way as a family, that it was like, oh, if you just like pull yourself up by your bootstraps and everything will be okay. For us, it was always a matter of the ecosystems and the environments that you live in could be the difference between thriving and
Mm.
the complete opposite. And my grandpa was always very, very complimentary of like, oh yeah, like this person took time to teach me to read, and this person took time to teach me to do math. But like literacy wasn't part of army training.
Mm.
But there were people who just sort of saw his hunger and said, yeah, look, it doesn't cost me very much to do this. Or like, hey, you haul me out from that battlefield, I'll teach you to read at night. And the environment actually can make a lot of difference. The culture makes a lot of the
Mm.
difference.
So you arrived in the US very young. How old were you?
It was 7. My father came here to
7.
do a PhD in electrical engineering and then got a job and just stayed here.
You didn't speak any English, or English was your second language. How did you
Yes.
find the transition coming in from China into the US, not speaking or not having a great, command of the language as such?
The unique thing about being firstborn is that I felt responsible very early to say if I could learn it faster, then I have to help my mom, right? I have to be the translator. I watched a lot of Disney movies. I've like virtually learned all of my English through watching Disney movies. Like could
Love
recite,
it.
Robin Hood and Sleeping Beauty from scratch. And then I think the other thing that really kind of attuned me to is when you go into a room and the jokes aren't funny to you because you represent a different, worldview or culture, it may be very sensitive to where are the places where you can make things happen and who are the people that can make things happen because they're very easily identifiable places. And then it also may be really sensitive to like inclusion versus exclusion. And humor is a great example of that, right? If your thing is, oh, I can hold court and be popular by telling jokes, you're
Mm.
not going to be able to like accommodate everybody. But if the way that you rally people is playing hide and go seek, you don't need any language. There's no language barrier for hide and go seek, right? So
No.
like, oh, some of those things are extremely inclusive leadership.
What was your favorite Disney movie? I have to ask that now.
Sleeping Beauty. Yeah.
Lovely. Now, after graduating from Berkeley, you joined Google in a technical recruiting role where you were working with some of the best engineers. What did working with Google teach you? I mean, that's kind of one of our defaults when we talk to leaders is Google is well known for a global brand, extremely successful. What was working for them like?
Well, I'll tell the story that I told a lot in my venture capital days. I had done graduate work in classical civilizations. So my undergraduate work was in neurobiology and classical civilizations, Greek and Roman civilizations. And I got pulled in by a recruiter to go interview for Google. And at my interview, the person who would become my manager, she said, you know anything about recruiting? Not really, right? I said, I don't know very much about recruiting. I know more than anyone would care to know about the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. And she said, oh, good. That's what we're afraid of. You should come here and do that. And this woman
Ah,
created a position for me to be an embedded data specialist on the tech recruiting floor. And some of my earliest projects was we dismantled the quote unquote culture fit test, where in the beginning, Google's test was if Larry or Sergey was stuck in an airport with you for 4 hours, do you have enough varied interests and mastery to be able to hold their attention? And I looked at all the data and I just said, like, I don't think that I would pass the airport test. And she's like, why? You do so many things you're interested in. Like, from my culture, you would never initiate conversation with somebody at that high level. Like, I would just
Mm.
assume that they were really busy and I would never try to talk to them unless they talked to me first. So this is a test for like being interesting and having mastery. I mean, I would never have realized that that was the test. And we then did a bunch of research and realized, yeah, this is a false test. If we're going to assess for culture, we should just assess for culture. So things like that were part of my early days. The thing that was so extraordinary, even in that story was, okay, here is Google who said, this is something that is a business problem we're concerned about. We will create a rule for you. You can write your own job description. And so long as you are metrics and data oriented, we will not get in the way of any insights that you have to offer. That's the interesting part of Google that, at least in that time, it's sort of different now that it's gotten larger, was particularly unique. Um, and then the second thing, which is sort of a well-known manager practice, is Jonathan Rosenberg had this policy that said, protect the diva and fire the jerk. So we all have people on our teams where like this person always like makes us go back to the drawing board when we thought we had a yes and everything was just like an easy like check mark, rubber stamp. They would just like open a whole bunch of cans of worms and then we have to go back to the drawing board. That person is the diva, and it's like we have to protect the diva because the diva defies assumptions. A lot of times you go in thinking that somebody else had done the diligence, so then we're all ready to prove. And actually, everybody assumed that of somebody else. And like, we actually needed to go back and ask, why does this project exist in the first place?
Mm.
I know it's not difficult to do, right? And it's the diva, and you have to protect that voice. Those couple of things. Eric Schmidt was very, very efficient. I got to work very closely with him when I was at Google Ventures. And his default was always like, who's saying no? So that default to open, we would be doing things like, I even remember when we're closing Uber as an investment. GV, we led the Series B for Uber. It was only like $100 million at the time as a company. And what they wanted was, could Google Maps create an integration that allowed people to find their way to another place using Uber as a special like favor to do the raise? And I'm sure that there were probably a lot of ways why it wasn't like great to give them an inside track, and the Maps team was not prepared to do that. It was integration was something that was not security compliant with Google standards, and Eric is just like, who's saying no? I'm not saying no. Even if it would be fun to try just to learn from the experiment, why wouldn't you do it?
Yeah, so no fear to say yes and not really over analyzing the risks or the consequences.
Yeah, it's not like let builders build, right? Build something, right? Then just get out of the way and let them build it, and hire people who are, good enough to say like, I messed up, I need help, and there will be no wasted learnings. And so he had sort of like that view from the top was really helpful. It
Mm.
was beyond don't ask for permission, right? It would actually like actively help other people to say yes.
Tell us a little bit about what you do today, because you're no longer with Google, but what do you do today?
Today, I'm a coach. I work with startups, predominantly in the, I would say, like sub 50, growing to 150, Series A, Series B financing stage, to help them scale their people and their revenue. So that's sort of the intersection that I like to work at. What are the real business metrics? And then how do you actually harness people power to be able to open opportunity?
Okay. With the organizations that you work with, when businesses are scaling up, what are some of the first cracks you start to see in leadership behavior?
Two biggest problems that I'm seeing right now. One, underestimating the cost of context switching. So super early in the company, the CEO assumes that they and everybody else will wear many hats. And that's the right thing to do when you're fighting for survival. And then as soon as you cross 25 people, sometimes as soon as you cross 12 people, the idea of wearing many hats becomes actually a context switch tax every single time. And you're bringing people into a situation where adaptability or speed actually is causing all sorts of energy leaks. The being able to be aware of that. The second thing is with related to AI. I think that we need to make a really sharp transition away from AI as a tool-based AI, into what I would call like human first AI. And this is The reality is that if what you are doing is you're saying, hey, associate who makes dashboards for me, use AI to make better dashboards, they might be able to increase their productivity from 5, 10 to 40, 50 dashboards. But that's not the right question. And it's actually very prone to the anxiety of, am I going to be replaced, right? It's like if you're asking a junior person to do this, they don't always know how to check for hallucinations, so you end up with quality control issues because of the use of tool-based AI. Whereas if your question was, hey, associate person, you are an extremely smart analytical thinker. I want you to be able to generate data insights. What would it mean for us to live in a world where you never had to make another dashboard and the data was just available to you because you know how to write and ask the right question, right? Then you've completely transformed something that actually allows the human to work at the higher level of judgment and intelligence and
Mm,
functionality.
mm.
And then they never have to make dashboards and they don't have to track if it's obsolete, right? But you can't teach somebody to make like so many dashboards that then they make a data tool that never requires dashboards again. It's a different imagination and it's a very different kind of assignment.
Mm.
So kind of that's the stuff with like, yeah, I'll get 1.2, 1.5 productivity with AI tools, but I will get a transformed business industry if I think of it from a human perspective.
You often describe high-performing teams as Olympic teams rather than championship teams. What's the
Oh yeah.
difference?
And I would say this is a very startup specific and I think also AI startup specific situation. When you are a known incumbent leader in a market, you have to build championships teams. And by that I mean year after year, quarter after quarter, you have to come back and like win and scare off your competition. And how do championships tend to recruit and reward their people? You hire domain experts and you pay them a lot of money, right? You're not really, the rookies are always like sort of like in the back. Your star players are people that are PR worthy. And what you're doing is you're trying to capture these teams that require almost no onboarding, no ramp up. They know how to do it. And then you just sort of like capitalize on that and get better at getting them to work together. That's a championship team. And that's really valuable when you are that incumbent or when you are at a place where you are already at a place of market dominance. But if you're not, or if you're trying to generate product for a behavior that doesn't exist yet, or for a market that's completely new, the domain expertise is almost in the same way that nostalgia is a lie. It's sort of more expensive and does not live up to its own hype because the baggage will actually get in your way of
Mm,
what you need to actually imagine a different thing. There was a reason why, if we go back to Uber was not invented by taxi companies. There was a reason
mm,
why Google was not, invented by admin, right? Like these people who have no baggage actually have a lot more potential to really see something in a completely different way. But then you can't build championship teams to seize new markets in the same way. You have to find Olympic teams. Olympic teams are generally mission oriented. They're not very well paid. They are 1% of genetic anomalies that exist in the universe. So the talent knows no boundaries, not even industry boundaries. And the most important thing is you make sure that you fire the mediocre ones very quickly and that you're really recruiting at that top high percent. The math problem of a championship team versus the Olympic team is also that if you are 10,000 people as a company, it is more expensive to replace the top 10% of good people who go because you're not competitive than the 70% of people who meet expectations. If you are a team of 100 people, it is always more expensive to replace the top 10% than it is to replace your middle to 70%. So that also kind of like skews the way that you're thinking about the ceiling and the floor in a very different way.
mm.
Startups have to think like Olympic teams. One, because your incentives are aligned for that. And two, because the domain expertise is inappropriately aligned for the stage of company that you're at.
Mm. Do you work with a lot of founders?
I do.
And how do you work with founders who become their own bottlenecks in the business? They can't see it, but maybe their leadership team sees it. So it's an interesting situation, is that leadership team sees something that the founder has become the bottleneck. It doesn't even have to be in a startup. It can be in a very, in an existing successful business where the founder suddenly becomes a bottleneck. How do you work with the founder in that instance to remove the bottleneck.
Yeah, 100% of the founders that I work with are exactly in that position. And I would say even as a founder myself, constantly battling that. The coaching question that we always ask in the sessions is, what are the things that only I can do versus all the things that I can do? And when you sort of unpack that, it's different depending on who is the team of execs that you've rallied around you. What does the team need you specifically to do? So I definitely think that's part of it. The second thing, oftentimes what I do is I just take resources away. I create constraints and forcing functions for the office of the CEO, right, or for the office of that leader. They're like, oh, I want to hire 20 more people to do 7 things. And you can actually really only be good at doing 2 things a year. So we're going to cap it. You can't hire 20 people. You can only hire 3. All right. Right. So don't worry. Right. I just don't give you that amount of time to be able to do it. And I just don't give you the resources to do it.
You talk about the shift of a founder from hero to founder as a host. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, we were talking a little bit earlier about this. I think that one of the most interesting transitions that have happened in leadership is just how much more complexity the expectations are for any leader in any place. Right?
Mm.
So like 15 years ago, all I needed to do, and if I was interviewing a VP of sales or a CEO, is business acumen and executive presence. And executive presence is like this fluffy thing that could have a lot of unconscious bias attached to it. But today, you need to be politically savvy. Your Twitter stream needs to have X number of followers. You need to do a little therapy. You need to be mindful of like work-life balance. All of those things are now part of the expectations for a manager at any given time. So I think that what we end up really needing to do is really to start with like other awareness cannot happen without self-awareness. So a lot of times I get a little bit meta and I go like, do you know what your superpowers are? Do you know what you're actually good at? Do you know what are the things that you can do without being fatigued? So I think like that's one of the first questions. And then the second thing that I do is like we do a lot of unpacking around like how are you listening properly for root problems versus presenting problems. So I think the host part of it is the listening part, right? The listening part is, okay, what am I doing? Everybody who is brought in as a hire is brought in with the highest, right, hopes and anticipation of what they can do. So then how are you actually creating spaces that allow them to actually thrive?
How do you work with leaders who often get high performance cultures wrong and that leads to attrition?
I would say that most of the startups that I work with, they don't get high performance culture wrong. They have just forgotten the thing that made them excited to go to work in their early days because they've been caught up in their own success and sort of the best practices that they think they're supposed to map themselves onto. So there's so many companies where they'll think like, oh, I'm now at this size. I should become more like Google, Amazon, Palantir, Apple, right? And they start to map themselves to something that's actually not themselves. And the funny thing that they never realize is, oh, there's a lot of secret business reasons behind this playbook that we just didn't publicize, right? And so you're mapping the outcomes of something, but actually that's not how the high performing population actually works. And a good example is you think about a place like Google, which was saying we'll hire as many good engineers as we can get. We'll pay them 50 to 100K sign-on bonuses to be able to keep them. And then you come into a company and you'll be able to do 20% projects with your free time, with company resources, do whatever you want. And I remember going to so many startups who had to do mass layoffs, right, because of overhiring during the pandemic. And I said to them, do you realize that as an ads industry, it is always more valuable to hoard talent for algorithms than it is to risk them going to a competitor? I mean, like, what startup have you ever been at where engineers had so much free time that I could create a free time program for them to do whatever they want? Like, what startup have you ever been at that had that problem? And they're like, oh, no. It's because the nature of the business, because you were an ads company, because you were a search company, that it was better to hoard them here, give them things to do, than to risk them going to Bing. It was a competitive problem. You are not in that business, so then this does not apply to you, right? So your idea of high quality or high density talent was, hire as many good engineers as possible. But if you're not in that industry, what you have created is low output per engineer, like free time programs that are not sustainable and overhiring that then will become, a layoff problem.
Mm. It's interesting, isn't it? Because there was a time where everybody wanted to have a business that will do what Google did, or will do what Uber did, or will do what, there's so many big brands out there. But the reality is we don't actually know what they did behind the closed doors. We only get to know what they did in terms of what they publicized. And
That's right.
unless you're going to scale up to be a Google, it's impossible to do.
That's right. Right. Like it was like, oh, so much of it is marketing. The marketing is not a lie. I do think that there were so many great things about the Google culture. But for example, Google was one of the first companies that rolled out a 6-month maternity leave because the US is still behind the rest of the world in terms of parental leave. And it was literally because we had data that showed a lot of senior female engineers who would go out for a 3-month maternity leave would not come back.
Mm.
And it was more expensive to try to find somebody to replace them than to just give them 3 extra months of salary. So we were one of the first, and then we basically said, let's make it a feature, not a bug. Let's make that part of our branding so we can attract more great female engineers. But it wasn't altruism that was at the end of it. And there were
Mm.
actually still a lot of gender inequality things going on inside. This one made sense from the math problem. So then we did that, right? But other people who were looking at it was like, oh, like this has got to be such a, equitable, right? And they come inside and oh, it's actually no, it's still got so many problems.
Maximus, I'm interested to know, as you're working with these leaders, whether they're founders or not, or startups or not, but generally as you're working with leaders in your coaching world, we talk a lot about leadership towards 2030 and how much leadership is changing. And we were talking off air about how I led in 2019 versus how I lead now is very, very different. What is some of the work that you're doing, and what are some of the, I guess, the common themes that you're starting to work with your leaders around, what does leadership look like? Because we can't change when we get to 2030, we've got to change now. So what are some of the things that you're seeing that you're already starting to do that work with leaders?
I would say a lot of it really comes down to how we designing systems for that 2030 understanding of the world. And, the first one is because we know that 2030 will be extremely AI heavy, as opposed to saying, what is my AI strategy? Or what is my AI lever? Really starting to think about what are the things that, from an ecosystem perspective, require co-creation and co-design with partners. So instead of one company trying to like kind of come up with everything themselves to beat the competition of a company that's closer to them, what does it mean for us to actually reach across the aisle and understand from an ecosystem level, what are the symbiotic relationships that can be happening? And that's definitely something that's different than early dot-com boom in the 90s and even early 2000s. But I do think that that's going to be a really important aspect of how business and industries get built in the future. The interesting thing when you think about this from an international perspective is, gosh, Singapore clients that I have, I'm sure Australian clients that I have as well, are all asking the question, if we do AI and it becomes overly reliant on US-based technologies, cloud servers, GPUs, and regulations change,
Mm.
then does my entire business then disappear? Right.
Mm.
And so it was like, oh, like how do I actually become to a certain extent like both ahead of the game, but also agnostic to some of these regulatory constraints that could just pull the rug under our feet? And the answer is not every continent, every market build your own GPUs and try to like, sort of defend against that. Although many national entities are starting to think about that. The UK is actively investing in hardware design, AI chip design for that reason. But some of these co-design partnerships actually protect you from being somebody who's run because you have been a co-creator of some of these infrastructures, right? So your IP is tied in a slightly different way than simply as a client or as a customer. Like the flip side of that is also true. Really large corporations like Salesforce or CRM products with AI, I can pretty much always build you your own instance of a CRM with your own data and your own workflow within 3 to 6 months. It does not require you to give your data to a large US company where the regulatories may be may shut down at any time.
Mm. So, what leadership capabilities do you think will become non-negotiable because of AI and speed and complexity?
Yeah. So the first thing, if I go back to my co-design example, you have to be very good at building trust, right? Like
Mm.
that's one thing that now all of a sudden I'm not just negotiating a price, I'm negotiating design and creation partnerships, not for R&D purposes, but as part of the core business. And so our leaders actually going to be able to negotiate and like build trust quickly for people who are and sort of understand that, just negate that sense of no silos and no two sides of the table. We're always on the same side of the table. We're really battling, right? A market that's moving too fast and can sweep us under. We're not battling each other. So I think that that's going to be a really key case. Building trust is also important for attracting the type of talent that you want to attract. I think that for industries like engineering, I don't think that we're going to need as many CS majors or computer scientists, but the few that we need will be extremely sought after and they will be the key to your business. So how are you going to be able to actually attract those people through building trust? The second thing is storytelling. I think that storytelling has become a little bit more in the zeitgeist, but in our business acumen and executive presence ecosystem of a CEO, of a leader, you didn't really need to do that much storytelling. Today, I do think that there's a lot of storytelling that is required for leaders. That the expectation of transparency, of purpose-driven work is really all pushing towards not a logical playbook manifesto of explanation, but something that actually feels as adaptable to any context as a story, but also as emotionally engaging and pride inspiring as a story.
Mm. So, if you were coaching a founder or an executive today for 2030, what would you tell them to? First part of this question is, what would you tell them to stop doing immediately?
I would tell them to stop explaining things as if everybody had their context. A lot of the communication that I see when alignment or productivity is an issue is the CEO who is never off work, thinks at level 15 every single day, every single minute of the day. And then they go into the meetings and they're kind of like just waiting for everybody to catch up with their vision and their context. And then they're like, oh, this is going too slow. Let me explain it to them. And then they'll like, oh, I'm at level 15. I'll explain it to them like they're at level 7, right? I'll come down halfway. I'll meet them halfway. But the team is at level 2.
Mm.
So level 7 is still, right? Like I think I've heard those syllables before, but I don't understand how that's going to affect my way of working. And then they will make up their own reasons to fill in the gaps, and that's almost always the wrong reasons. So just stop trying to explain it at level 15, like go down to level 1 and like explain it to them properly.
Mm. What would you tell them to start doing?
Start asking the question, what is the thing that only I can do versus everything that I can do? Become ruthlessly and relentlessly, good at focusing and saying no to things.
And so, when you think about the leaders that you most admire, what do they consistently do that others don't?
They have North Stars for decision making that empower other people to make decisions very quickly. So if we kind of go back to the Eric Schmidt example, who's saying no is a very good guiding post for things that then he does not need to micromanage. There's a startup in the biotech industry that I work at, and his catchphrase was always, we do the hard thing first. And so they are able to make those trade-offs when it comes to everything in a way that works really, really well for planning. And it makes even the, IC who is 2 weeks into the company really clear about what it is that they are supposed to be focused on and what they have power or they feel empowered.
So, Maximus, I've got an interesting question for you because, we talk a lot about AI and how AI is going to get better at giving us answers and doing more and more of the work. And as we move towards that world, from a leadership and human equity perspective, what will matter more, or how do we balance? Do we get better at asking better questions, making better calls, or building better humans around us? Or is it a mixture of all three?
I think it's really, for me, more about alignment for what AI can do versus what humans can do. Similar to globalization, it's not something that we can really manufacture or control. It's happening. but globalization can create more peacemaking entities, more climate saving entities, or it can create more colonization and empire building entities. And AI is almost exactly the same way. It is like globalization. So if we're trying to do things that, like, what can the machine do that a human can do and therefore eliminate humans? To do that, well, maybe it was because humans weren't supposed to be doing those things in the first place, right? Maybe data entry, manual data entry, was not a best use of a human brain,
Mm.
and we had this situation. So I think that that's where I come back to a human first AI is a very different kind of scenario than a tool based AI. And I thought there was a company that I was working with in Japan, and they had this customer service situation where they measure the productivity of their best customer service agents. They answer 300 calls, a week compared to a mediocre one who's only answering 47. And they said, great, I'm going to give my top AI performers AI tools and tell them, you know, build whatever you need to build to make, customer service as productive as possible. And what do they do? What have all of the customer service entities done? They've built bots that are generally pretty low quality, extremely inhuman, but will get the job done.
Mm.
And then they sort of hired a VP of data in, and the data person asked the question, like, why are so many people calling in the first place? Like, does our product not work properly that there's so many customer service requests? And this was a travel company. And it turns out that 50, 60% of the calls came from people who just wanted an email copy of their itinerary. They built a button in the workflow that says, like, press this button if you need an email copy of your itinerary. And it immediately removed X number of
Of
calls.
course.
And then, they didn't need as many customer service agents. And you could have stopped the story there. And that would map to, almost 100% of customer service entities that we know. But Japan, they just sometimes will ask a second question, which is, I wonder who these people are that are making the calls in the first place. And then they discovered that the majority of the callers were elderly people who were very lonely or extremely uncomfortable with technology.
Mm.
And so then they said, gosh, maybe what we do is we don't lay off everybody who's not a customer service agent. And we tell them, take as much time as you need to take that give the person on the other side of the call a good experience, because it could be that they're really lonely, or it could be that they don't understand the technology that they're dealing with. And a bot was never going to be able to answer the question in the first place. And so now what happened is, right, it's a completely different understanding of productivity. The lifetime value and utilization of each customer went up because, of course, if you teach somebody how to use the technology and all the other ways that they could be using it to benefit them in a way that makes them feel safe and empowered and comfortable, they will spend more money and buy more features. And that's the difference, right? That's the difference.
Mm. It's so interesting, Maximus, they asked that second and third question, right? Or they went down that and they had a real customer lens around that, because not all businesses, in fact, I defy many businesses or majority of businesses to think in that way, because you look at your bottom line and you know what, I can remove X number of people from and increase profit. And, the customer's got what they want. They've got a button, print your itinerary out and you're fine. But the fact that they were looking at who the customer was and what their need was, that's wow.
Yeah. And I think that that's the difference sometimes between a CEO with that storytelling instinct
Mm.
versus a CEO who only has business acumen and executive presence, right? Because the answer that you're looking for is, how do I save money and do the same? But that's never going to be a great story, right? I laid off 50% of the people. We got very productive with AI using bots that nobody wants to talk to. That's not a great
That's
story,
not a good
right?
story.
But the story of, like, who are the humans behind that, and like, what is the story behind that, and what is the story that's going through their mind, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, this extremely inefficient thing, which with a human at the end of it, actually is helping us to give dignity to an elderly population who should
Mm.
not be left behind by our technology, and who
Mm.
is who we want to serve at the highest quality of service as well. Well, that's huge.
And we talked about this earlier about the storytelling piece, but I think leaders, CEOs, directors, boards, I think that, that is a real skill set to try and instill into our leaders as we move towards 2030, because I believe that that's going to be the key difference between businesses that are hugely successful versus those that, yeah, they have a range of success, but if you don't have that human element, you probably won't have as much.
I agree with that. And I think in general, doesn't it just feel better to be a leader that knows the stories of the people and the story that you're trying to build, even if it's a little bit of our own mythology making, it still gives so much more. It's generative energy, right? It's
Mm.
giving energy and not taking energy away.
So, Maximus, we've come to that part in our podcast where we call the spotlight shuffle. If you were in the same room as me, I'd give you 20 questions in a fishbowl and you'd pick one out and we'd cover that question. So we don't know what question is going to come up. We're doing this digitally. So you're going to give me a number and I'll ask you the question against that number.
Uh,
You'll get about 3 or 4 picks of this. So what's your first number?
let's go number one.
Well, number one, in 3 words, describe what it means to be a future fit leader.
Storyteller, imagination, people first.
Okay. We've really talked about the people first and the storytelling. Why the imagination piece?
Because I think that there's so many industries that don't exist today that will
Mm,
exist because of AI,
mm,
and it will take imagination to really see those openings.
I like that. All right. What's the next number?
Let's go number 11.
Number 11. Okay. What's a habit or ritual that keeps you grounded, especially doing chaos?
Oh, I like to do this thing, and sometimes I do it with my clients at the beginning of the session, where I would just ask them, like, take 3 breaths and then tell me 3 words that describe how you're feeling right now. And it's a really good check-in exercise. It's a really good grounding exercise. And it also makes sure that you are present to
Mm,
yourself when you're going from place to place.
What's the common answers you get?
Most of the time they'll say like, oh, I should have known you would ask this question. That's the first thing that they'll say. And then they'll say, oh, tired, overwhelmed, and excited. And they're like, oh, you are feeling things that are in conflict with each other. So is that how you go about most of your day? Like that's been all morning. All morning I've just been in conflict with myself. It's really
Mm.
good to know.
And that's a whole other podcast right there.
Yeah.
Okay, one more number.
Let's go number 15.
Number 15. What's a small moment in your career that left a big impact on you, but you rarely get to talk about it?
I would say that there was there was a really late night when I was working in venture capital, where I was in the office with the legal team and the finance team, and we're trying to close some sort of investment. And one of the finance specialists was on her way to the bathroom, and she said, "Oh, I should call my husband. He's been waiting for me at the restaurant." And I just kind of stopped and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, you missing?" And she said, "Today is my anniversary. I thought we would finish earlier, but it's very clear that I'm not, so I'm just going to tell him. It's okay. We've been married for 15 years. It's not even a big deal. Sort of like very much forgiving." And I remember going to her manager afterwards and just saying like, "Oh, did you know that we'll call her Jessica? It's Jessica's anniversary. She's here. She's working really hard. We should do something to make it up to her." And so the next week, her manager wrote like basically got a $3,000 like whatever gift card to some French Laundry type restaurant
Mm.
weekend away, and gave it to her and just said like, "Thank you so much for your work. We don't say thank you enough, and please thank your husband." Let's And I just remember 5 years after that day, she was onboarding a new hire, and she said, "This is such a place that cares about humans." I remember that, I had to miss my anniversary dinner with my husband, and the company bought us a plane ticket to go anywhere. Like she totally exaggerated the rewards. They sent us on a cruise to go on vacation afterwards. Like if you do your job the way you're supposed to, we'll always take care of you. And it was just such a small moment or something that like in the grand scheme of things didn't cost that much money,
Mm.
but just like remembering to slow down and like appreciate somebody's effort, like it buys you retention, it buys you wellness, but also it just has such massive rippling effects, right?
Mm.
So I would say that's one of those moments where I'll always remember it's worth it to take the extra step to do that, right?
Mm.
And in the same way, my old boss at GV, every time we had a holiday party, we would invite plus ones and family. And the toast at the holiday party would be to the family. And he would say the same thing every year. He would say, "It's only because you let us borrow your spouses and your partners and your dads and your sons that we get to run this business and I get to work with some of the best people that make me want to come to work every day.
Mm.
This party is for you. Thank you so much for lending us your love. Those types of things, right? A massive impact on the way that I think about what a leader can do to establish that human first quality.
Mm. Well, it's a great note to end our podcast on. Maximus, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your journey, and all the best in whatever you do in the USA.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
If you like what you've heard, please share, rate and review this podcast, and don't forget to share it with anyone who might benefit from hearing it. The producer of Future Fit Leadership is Maritza Barone from Guide Your Light Network. If you would like to reach out to me, please DM me on any of my social media platforms. I'm available for speaking at conferences or consulting to your business. Future Fit is created in partnership with Future Leadership, a capability ecosystem for boards and executives. If you'd like to join the community and receive a free takeaway each week, sign up to the Future Exchange app in my show notes. Thank you for having me in your space. This is a Guide Your Light Network production, creating podcasts with purpose.